It's come to my attention recently that I give bad mixing advice. Let's talk about that. Specifically, let's look into a couple of the pieces of advice that I give that get a lot of negative feedback and see if it is indeed actually bad advice or if there's something else at play here. By the way, if you want to see for yourself some of my bad advice firsthand, head over to 5stepmix.com and get a free copy of my 5-step mix guide, because number 4 is one of the ones we're going to talk about in this video. Before we dive into the specific bad advice that I gave, let's set the stage here for a second. There are 4 things that I know to be true, and then a piece of advice on the back end of that. First thing I know to be true, being wishy-washy is annoying. I remember as a leader at like my church leading the band years ago, when I was first learning how to kind of lead in that context, I would be really wishy-washy. I would say, how do you guys want to start this song? What do you want to do here after the chorus? And I would literally push it back onto them. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? How do you want to handle this? And while collaboration is great, getting feedback from other people, wonderful, but my job in that scenario was to be the leader. A friend of mine tells a story of playing on a big-time Nashville studio session with a big-time Nashville producer, and he was super excited to work with this specific producer who has all kinds of credits. And my friend's a drummer, and he walked up to the producer and said, okay, so what are you looking for drum-wise on this song? What's your vision for the drums? Producer said, I don't know, you're the drummer, figure it out. And my friend was so deflated. Yes, he's the drummer. Yes, he brings his drumming expertise to the conversation. But people in general, in those kinds of situations, want to be led. My drummer friend wanted him to say, you know what, I'm looking for kind of a pretty aggressive but kind of straightforward beat. Something like, or like, I've been listening to this record and those drum tones really doing it for me right now. Something along those lines. That's all they're looking for. And as me, like up there leading the music, hey, why don't we start this with just acoustic guitar and some percussion, and then full band come in at the end of verse 1, right? And we can make that decision, and we can change the decision if we need to, but being wishy-washy and never really having an opinion is annoying. That's the first piece of this. Second truth, being confident is helpful. So that's kind of the opposite of this one, right? Versus if I never have an opinion, I wouldn't have this channel after 15 years. I wouldn't still be doing this if I had the habit of never stating something with confidence. Because if I came on here and said, well, here's what I think, but I'm not telling you what to do. Like you have to figure it out for yourself. This is just one way to do it. I feel weird just saying it like that. Being confident and making a statement is good. It's a good thing. That's kind of what we're drawn to that. So that's kind of the opposite of wishy-washy. Now, if you take that confidence a little bit further, you get to truth number 3, which is being polarizing can be good for business. Look at politics. The politicians who are super polarizing get all the attention, both positive and negative. The idea of like book reviews, the 1-star reviews and the 5-star reviews are really what drive the book industry. People will either buy the book because they hate it so much, or they'll buy it because they love it. 3 stars, kind of mediocre, wishy-washy, not that important. It's the same with just about anything. So for people who maybe are out there saying that I give bad advice, let's say, or they do videos of here's all the bad advice on the internet. This video I'm making right now is at least kind of tapping into that a little bit, because I think the thumbnail of this video says bad mixing advice, right? So, controversy. I want in on that. So part of this is good for business, and I think we're all aware of it, right? It's not like we're pulling one over on you by occasionally trying to make some more polarizing statements to help make a point. Okay, so that's the third thing. Fourth thing, this one is sad but true. A lot of times people don't use common sense, right? For example, let's say I make a statement and I say salt is amazing. Salt is my favorite seasoning. And then someone says, well, I heard Joe say that salt is amazing, so I decided to bake a cake and only use salt as my primary seasoning. And the cake was terrible, ergo, Joe gives bad advice. Right? You see, it's a ridiculous example, but you can see how that's what people do when they want to kind of tear down another piece of advice. They don't actually understand it, and therefore they can't really tear it down. So those are the 4 kind of things that I'm thinking about, truths I'm thinking about coming into this video. And the 5th is a piece of advice. Don't blindly follow advice, whether it's from me or someone else. It is a good idea to take advice. First, if the advice doesn't even resonate with you, then maybe just leave it on the table. But if it resonates with you and a part of you thinks that actually might work for me, then go test it. Go try it on something. It will either work or it won't. If it does work, great. Incorporate it into your process. If it doesn't work, you have a couple options. You can say, nah, didn't work for me. Not my cup of tea. Or you can say, maybe it didn't work for me because I don't quite understand it yet. That's an option. Or maybe it is legitimately bad advice. All of these are fair, and they're on the table, and I think we should all be in the habit of kind of questioning why we do the things that we do, especially when it comes to making music in the studio, because there are a million decisions to make. We want to make sure we're making mostly good ones. You know what this reminds me of? Business. There are a million ways to run a successful business. There are so many different types of businesses. I have a specific type that I love the most and is my favorite. Does that mean all the other types of businesses are wrong or bad? No, it just means I have a favorite. Fun fact, I actually started a second YouTube channel to talk about my experience as an entrepreneur and business owner over the last 15 years. So if you're into that kind of stuff, there's a link in the description to go check out that channel. All right, let's get into it. What is this bad advice that I've been giving? I'm going to give you 2 examples, kind of 2 of my more popular pieces of advice. And I'll divide it into kind of 3 sections each. So the first, I'll explain what the advice is. Second, I'll demonstrate the advice. And then third, I'll show you where people get it wrong. So let's jump into the first one. The first one is subtractive EQ. This is something I've talked about forever. And it's this concept of if I have a track that doesn't sound right and needs EQ, which, by the way, is a whole thing. Does it even need EQ to begin with? And if it does need EQ, I like to approach it from the standpoint of a subtractive method versus an additive method. What does that mean? It means I would prefer, at first, to take away frequencies that are hurting the sound versus boosting the frequencies that are helping the sound. Remove the bad frequencies first versus boosting the good frequencies. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here is a snare drum. So this is just the raw snare track. When I listen to that snare, I think, okay, I want it to be more psh, right? More upper mid-range. I want it to be a little fuller. There's things that I want to happen with this snare. But the biggest thing that I hear is goo, goo, goo. Listen to it again. Boom, boom, boo. Now, every drum, every snare drum will have some ring to it. I don't want to get rid of it, but right now, if I'm like visualizing it in my head, like here's the frequency response of that snare drum, and the thing that's most prominent to me is goo, goo. There's like a mid-range, low mid-range frequency that's dominating that sound. I would like to get rid of that. Now, 2 ways I suppose to do that. We could boost all the other frequencies to get in line with that, or we could find that frequency and pull it down. In my mind, cutting one frequency is better than boosting lows and highs. That is half as many moves, right? Boost lows, boost highs, or cut mids. Which one is simpler? The second one. I like simpler. I like seeing how few moves I can take to do things. That's just a life philosophy that I like. I love to be efficient and quick. You should see all the keyboard macros that I use. It is borderline psychopath. But let's look at the audio and find that frequency. So I'm assuming it's down in here somewhere. Let me hit play. We probably see it on the frequency graph here. It's probably right in here. Now let's just find it. We're going to do a narrow thingamajig. We're going to find it till it goes, ooh, and then we're going to pull it down. Found it. All right. Now we're just going to keep that narrow and pull that sucker down. Now I've turned this knob, this up and down gain knob, into the whoo knob. So I may want some of that whoo in there, and I can adjust how much this way. But if I pull it down, I get rid of the whoo altogether, and now it's, to me, just a snare drum. I like that. Now, that's the example of, sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way to approach this. That's the example of subtractive EQ. I listen and I think, the first thing I think is, are there things that need to be removed? Because the way I think about mixing is we're taking a whole bunch of tracks and we're blending them together. So the problem with that is when you have a bunch of tracks, they're all adding sound to the system. So typically speaking, when I hit play on a bunch of tracks without any processing on them, there's usually buildup of different amounts of frequencies. My proposed solution is to remove the frequencies that aren't helping so that they don't build up as much, versus going in and adding more sound to the entire mix. Now, this comes from a perspective of people tend to have too much going on. They tend to have too much in different frequency ranges. So my just logical approach is, if there's too much of something, let's pull it down, versus pushing up the other good stuff. Now, here's the thing where, so that's the philosophy, that's the thought process. Here's where people stop using their smart brains and common sense. They think subtractive EQ means I only cut, I never boost. Now, I'll be honest, at one point in my history here, years ago, I used to say, jokingly, boosting is the devil. It's not. Boosting is wonderful. Boosting, I mean, EQs go both up and down. I use boost all the time. To use this example here, I might actually further do a cut just in the mid-range on this snare drum, but I might also boost some of the low end to get some more foomp to it. And then I might also boost a little bit of that sizzle in the top end to help it cut through the mix more. Look what I've done. I've cut twice and I've boosted twice. The horror. He doesn't use subtractive EQ. Yeah, yes I do. Because subtractive EQ is a philosophy that says, I'm going to remove the things that are causing problems first, then let's see what happens. Then boost if needed. And by the way, that if needed statement is true of everything I do. I don't add compressors unless it needs a compressor. I don't add EQ unless it needs an EQ. And I don't do subtractive EQ unless it needs subtractive EQ. So there are times where I listen to something and say, oh, I just need to boost the highs on that. That's fine. That's what I would do. Subtractive EQ just means my first thought is there something I need to remove? And then my second thought is there something I need to boost? Here's the problem. Can you get a good mix without subtractive EQ? Absolutely. Right? It's possible. It's certainly possible. I think there are people who maybe they just connect in their heads more with boosting things more so than cutting them. And I think more power to them. For me, the way my brain is wired and the way I've worked for the last couple of decades is I find that there's typically an excess of things that I want to remove versus wanting to add more stuff, pile more stuff on top of the mix. Doesn't mean if you do like an additive approach to EQ that you're doing it wrong. Of course not. That's the difference between my advice and other people's advice. I don't dog on other people's advice. I think subtractive EQ is the best. You might disagree, but we can absolutely both get good mixes. I would argue I can get there faster with subtractive EQ. You may argue the other, and that's fine. All right, one piece of bad advice down. Second one up, you probably guessed it already, top-down mixing. Boy, I did a couple of videos on this a few months ago, and it stirred the pot. For a few people. A few people got pretty triggered by this whole concept of top-down mixing. So let's go through the same process. Let me explain it, let me demonstrate it, and then let me show you where people go wrong with it. Top-down mixing is, in its simplest form, the idea of taking your tracks, and routing them to a bus. And then thinking in terms of the overall bus, all the drum tracks, for example, before thinking about the individual components. That's the essence of top-down mixing. Top being, the ultimate top being your mix bus, and then it's kind of like a pyramid. Up here is the mix bus. Here are all the buses for all your different tracks. drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, vocals, and then here are the individual tracks. And the thought process is, it's very simple, thinking in terms of the top one first before moving down to the individuals. That's the idea. It's just kind of a framework. Again, it's just kind of a philosophy. So how would that work on something like drums? For me, when I'm listening to drums, once I've got the levels set, I'm going to do something like listening to the overall drum kit to see how it sounds. And the first thing I might do is put some processing on the drum bus to see how it sounds. And for me, that'll probably mean doing some bus compression and doing some EQ. So these are the actual settings that I used on this mix, using this compressor and using an EQ just to cut out everything around 360 hertz. Because guess what? There are a few universal principles in drums, but a lot of times there's a buildup at 400 hertz that when you pull it down, it almost always sounds nice. So I would rather do that on my drum bus than have to go do it on the individual channels. Again, it comes down to efficiency. Why do 8 EQs when one will do the trick? So I'm going to hit play on this. I'll turn the plugins off, then I'll turn them on so you can hear what they're doing. Okay, with a compressor and an EQ, these drums sound a lot more mixed. It's not aggressive compression. It's turning up the volume a little bit, which is a little tricky. But you can see, even looking at this, like what the gain reduction is. The kick is barely hitting it. The snare is hitting it a little harder, and it's smacking both of them down. Otherwise, it's not doing all that much. And then this is just turning down some of that boxiness that can be in the drums. That is what I'm talking about with top-down mixing. Sometimes I might go more aggressive with this just to see how it sounds. If I can get, here's the concept. If I can get the drum mix to sound great with just drum bus processing, neat. I might be done with the drums. I've had mixes before where I've put some processing on the bus. I've thought, man, that sounds great already. I've gone on to work on bass, guitars, vocals, and I end up with a finished mix, and I come back and say, oh, I forgot to put plugins on the individual like kick and snare tracks. Guess what? It didn't need it because I was able to get a cool tone right here on the bus level. That's top-down mixing. That's the concept. Here's where people forget their smart brains and forget common sense and mess things up. They tend to think that what top-down mixing means is I do all my processing on the buses. I get my entire drum mix here. You'll notice what I said before is I start here, and occasionally, very occasionally, just doing this gives me the sound that I want. More often than not, this is a good starting point, and then I zoom into the individual tracks to do the things that need to be done. So for example, on this mix, you can see I added in not a ton of tracks, but a fair number of plugins across these tracks. The overhead got a little bit of EQ, taking out more of that mid-range. The room tracks got some EQ as well, doing a similar EQ and taking out some of the cymbals there. They were a little bright. The kick drum got an EQ that just boosted the crap out of 60 hertz just to make it nice and beefy. And then the snare drum got some parallel processing with some extra compression to make it snap a little bit more. I'll take my first EQ off because that's going to mess up what was there. So here is the kind of quote-unquote final drum mix. And here it is with just the bus processing that I had. And here it is without any bus processing. Guess what? I did stuff on the bus. I also did stuff on the individual tracks. It's the same underlying principle as subtractive EQ. I'm not saying it all has to happen at the bus. I'm saying the bus is the first place I stop on my little journey of mixing these drums. Same with, let's say, background vocals. If I have 50 background vocals, I could go EQ each of them individually, or I could put some EQ on the background vocal bus and see if that gets me there 1,000 times faster. And a lot of times it does. Now, the common feedback people might say is, well, you might want a different compressor on the kick and the snare than what you have on the drum bus. Sure. Great. That's why I don't go super aggressive on the bus, so I can then add a different compressor on the snare and then maybe add one to the kick if it needs it. This example, the kick drum didn't need another compressor because this one made it sound exactly like I wanted without having to do any extra work. Now, are there downsides to top-down mixing? Yeah, absolutely. There are downsides to every approach. That's the big takeaway. None of these are flawless. The downside of top-down mixing means sometimes you put too much stuff on the bus and you do end up fighting yourself with stuff that you do earlier in the chain on the individual channels. So you have to learn how the balance works between those. But guess what? The same is true for what would be called bottom-up mixing, where you mix the kick and the snare and the individual drums, then you get to the drum bus. If you do anything on the drum bus, then that's going to affect what you've already done on the individual channels. It's the same thing, just backwards. I prefer the backwards approach, starting with the bus. Maybe if I was in a different genre, I would change things. I mixed a song just last week where I didn't do much top-down mixing because the song didn't call for it, and that was fine. I've not abandoned my principles. It's just a principle. It's just a way for me to think about the entire mix, not as 30, 40, 50 tracks, but as 8 buses. Drums, bass, electrics, acoustics, keyboards, vocals, background vocals, and then maybe some strings or some other kind of crazy instrument, brass or something like that. That's it. When I'm thinking in terms of just those things, I can wrap my head around the mix. And then I can zoom into the individual elements as needed, as much as needed, but I can also do stuff on the bigger zoomed out level of the buses themselves. And that brings me to my final 2 points. First of all, don't be afraid to share your opinion. Don't be afraid if people disagree with you that will be the end of the world. If anything, disagreements make me better because, second piece of advice, it helps me understand why I do what I do. And that's my advice to you. Understand why you do what you do, why you choose to work in whatever way that you work. And that means understanding the pros and the cons of what you do. If something is worth doing, then it's worth challenging to see if it's the best way for you. That means you have to at least admit that there are good sides and bad sides to what you do. I think the pros of subtractive EQ and top-down mixing outweigh the cons. You might disagree, and that's fine. I'm going to stick with top-down mixing and subtractive EQ because I enjoy them and I like the results that I'm getting with them. What about you? Agree, disagree? Leave a comment and let me know. Also, if you haven't seen my video on why top-down mixing is the GOAT, aka greatest of all time, you can watch this video now. Thanks for watching. See ya.